I was called on, delegated by Natalie. She said she learned how to delegate through this last session. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. So she actually asked me to introduce James. For those of you who have heard, yesterday I've known James since about 1995. What happened, I was working at Wayne State University, and I had a project called Building Cultural Competence in Human Services and Advocacy Organizations. At that time, I was looking for consultants to help me get through this. I was wet behind the ears on the topic and was blessed to meet both Tawara Good, who was the director of the National Center for Cultural Competence, and she just kept telling me, you got to meet James, you got to meet James. I'm like, okay. And so those two became my consultants on that project. They taught me everything that I needed to know about being a culturally competent practitioner, beginning my journey and keeping my journey going. James is the developer of the Cultural Competence Self-Assessment Questionnaire, which we use within our organizations and did some action planning within those human services and advocacy organizations around cultural competence. He's a very bright man, as I know you've seen, and I love him because he has also, within all of that brilliance, a great sense of humor. And so I am pleased to be here. I'm so thankful to have those kind of colleagues working with me who are willing to not only teach me what I need to know to grow as a leader, but also to share everything. He's not selfish about anything. You can call him if you have a question, call him if you need assistance, and he will be there for you. And so, right, James? Yeah. And if you need to go shopping, ladies, take the big guy who can carry the bags. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. James Mason, my mentor and my most prized possession of a colleague. Thank you.
So you guys ready to go 2 more hours? No, you know what? There is a change in plans. In your packet is my second PowerPoint, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty more of a didactic or academic kind of presentation, and I don't want to do that. What I want to do is I want to show you an exercise that I think you can take home with you. A couple of you are going to have to move, but you'll get over that. The first time I did this, I think, was in 1987, and I was much younger and much more naive. I got a call from a group out of a national group of psychologists wondering if I would come to a workshop on cultural competence. No, but it was a workshop for 1,500 psychologists, and which was somewhat intimidating. It was one of my first workshops, and then they wanted it to be interactive, right? And when you're young and you don't really know how to say no very well, and you just keep saying yeah and keep saying yeah, and I'll figure it out later. So I finally got off the phone and I said, well, I guess I've never done a workshop, 1,500 people, let alone 1,500 people, and making it interactive. And we pulled a rabbit out of our hat on that one, and I want to show you that. But what I just want to talk to you a little bit about with respect to assessment, which I think is important, are several main points that I would like you to walk away with. And then we're going to walk through an exercise I think might be fun, and it will certainly get us out of here before 5 o'clock, and I think it's going to be important. When we think of assessment, we're not assessing organizations or individuals to rate them. We don't want to give them a score. We don't want to tell people they're good, they're bad, or what have you. A couple of reasons. One is when we tell people they're good, they roll over dead on us, right? And they say, well, I'm all that. I don't need any more. I'm fixed. And the bad thing about cultural competence is you don't get fixed. Just when you learn a group of people, they change on you. Their circumstances change on you. So, for example, some of your states are wrestling with real rapid diversification of Latino populations. So if you look at places like the Carolinas, Kentucky, some of the southern states, some of the Midwestern states, the Latino population is growing there 300% to 400% per year, right? The numbers are low, so it isn't a major shift yet. But even so, you don't see a similar shift in terms of the workforce. So you don't see the Latino workforce or Spanish-speaking workforce growing at a commensurate rate, right? So that becomes an issue for us in a large way. The other thing that's interesting is that we still are seeing immigrant groups coming to various parts of the U.S. So, for example, where we live in Oregon, one of the more recent groups are the Somali population. I think the largest populations also exist in Minnesota and in Ohio, if I remember correctly. It has a very large Somali population. All it will take is a war, political upheaval, economic problem, environmental cataclysm, and we have a new group with us. So the idea of becoming culturally competent and being fixed at any one given point in time just doesn't work. I was talking to some people earlier about even understanding issues around gender. I'm old enough that I remember the women's movement, and I remember the symbolic burning of women's bras and stuff, right? So if I want to be real cool and I want to empower women to burn their bras, that really doesn't impress them at all. I mean, they're much too expensive these days to be burning up. No, really. And the symbolism is totally lost. So the notion of how one becomes culturally competent and staying so is different. And even like I said, the nomenclature, what we called ourselves 10 years ago, and what we call ourselves 10 years from now, who knows? So when we think of assessment, we aren't assessing to give someone a rating. We're assessing to design an intervention specific to that entity, whether it be an individual or an organization. Only to assess later to see which of this intervention stuck and which of it still needs to happen. Okay? Does it make any sense to you? So when I work with organizations, what I tend to suggest to them is they may want to take a look at themselves every 18 to 36 months, because it's probably going to take about 18 months for some of the more mid-range interventions to take place. And for sure by 3 years, we think those will have happened. But we want to reassess so that we can design a new intervention after that. So it's not a static measure like an SAT, like an LCAT, like an LSAT, like an MCAT, things of that nature. We don't want to give someone a label of being good, as I said, because they'll roll over dead on you. We don't want to give someone a label of being bad because they feel so overwhelmed that they give up. And then when we think of whether good or bad, what we might find is that I'm good with Latinos, but I suck totally with Native Americans. Right? Or I'm good with Somalis, but I don't do well at all with Ethiopians. So am I really good or bad? And it varies by group. So we want to be it varies by subgroup. So for example, if I'm in Ohio, and I think Ohio has 2.5 million African Americans, anybody from Ohio? I think that's about what you have. Well, we might find in Ohio that there are parts of Ohio where you might, Cincinnati for example, where you might be able to work with an all-black population in some cases. But there's such variation within the African American community that you might be more effective with these and less effective with these. You might be effective with those at a certain age group or a certain income group, but you might be less effective with a certain income group or an age group or street group. So, or you might be more effective with, let's say, Native Americans on the res and less effective with Native Americans off the res, if that makes any sense to you. So we don't really want to give anybody or an organization a rating of good, bad, or what have you. We want to help them look at how they might be intervened with or trained or adapt to be more effective with the populations they serve, if that makes any sense to you so far. Okay. In many cases, we're going to ask some very personal questions when we do the assessment. So we want to create a safe environment for people to respond totally candidly. And I've been in some places where, people use racial epithets openly, and I wanted them to use those in their assessment process. Now, what I had to do in order to do that was I had to guarantee all my people that participated in the assessment process their safety, because I didn't want to drive anything underground. I wanted people to feel free to, if you call those people that, say it on the assessment process, if that makes any sense to you. Again, so we don't want what are called socially desirable responses. We don't want what's called a response set. So if you ask people if they like diversity, what are they going to say? Yeah, what else are you going to say? That's all you're going to say. So we want to give people the opportunity to say, no, I think it sucks. I think we cater to these people. We want all that kind of stuff. So in order to say that, I have to make sure that if I give you a questionnaire and I get it back, there's nothing on that questionnaire that is identifying you. Or if it isn't anonymous and it's confidential, that I hold it in strict confidence and I won't even let the people that contract with me know who said that or from which department it came. Because if we're using demographic data, all it takes is an age, a language spoken, a nationality that will out a given person in a workforce. If you're the only person there over 65 and you put that on your form, you're done in. If you're the only person of Haitian background and you put that on there, your anonymity is gone, if you understand what I'm saying. So we want to make sure that we create a safe environment for people to say whatever they want to say. And now in doing that, you may, what I've been called along the way, people said we didn't have any problems before until you came, all that kind of stuff. Or you must work for the Nazis because What you're doing is people are people. So what are you trying to do when you come in here? So, and I think of all the places I've worked, probably maybe 40 of the 50 states, a lot of people have welcomed me. Other people haven't been as welcoming. But ultimately, my goal has been not to rate a group, but to help them get better. The third thing that we want to think about is making sure that we explain the goals to the individuals within the organization. What I'm not there to do is decide whether they should fund agency A or agency B, whether they keep worker A or worker B. That's not my job, and I can't comment on that, and I wouldn't comment on that. Going back to the reason, I remember teaching this stuff for 20 years, and if I took my own class, I would get an A, without a doubt. If someone else took my class, they may get an A, but what they would learn is about this much because they came in down here. I come in here, I learned this much. So who really deserves an A, right? This person grew this much, I grew this much. So the whole notion of how we rate knowledge or how we grade folks is really kind of difficult because what it doesn't take into account is someone's ambition to know more, their dedication, their determination. So for example, those of you who've gotten to grad school and you had to complete the GRE or other types of entrance exams, what they never really were effectively able to measure was your determination to get through. And we've all known people, and we may have even been one, that were not predicted to succeed in our academic program because of whatever reason, but we were going to make it through no matter what. And so again, when we think about this assessment process, we want to make sure that we're not rating, and we want to explain to people that we're doing this to identify ways for the organization to get better, and in some cases for the individual to improve. The other thing that we found it important to do was create what we called site codes. So for example, if it's a large organization and we have Department A, Department B, Department C, so forth, we wanted to make sure that if there were 20 people in Department A, that we got approximately 20 questionnaires back from Department A. If there are 18 there, we got 18 back. So we could compute the return rate by unit. We also began to notice that, because see, if this group didn't participate at all, did we want to reassess them, or did we want to take that into account in doing the analysis? With respect to a site code, we developed what's called a demographic sheet, which identified such factors that we saw as predictive or related, having relationships to the outcomes, such as race, age, ethnicity, education. We even asked some very specific questions. For example, one of the questions we asked were how many cultural workshops did you attend over the last 20 years? Here's an interesting answer. What we've got on average over the last 50,000 surveys has been 2. Right? So over a 20-year period, people typically go to about 2 diversity workshops. Now, you guys are a very, very special group you guys are a very, very special group for a number of reasons. So you may have more, but on average, that was kind of daunting. That once every 10 years we attend a cultural workshop probably isn't enough to stay abreast of what's going on. So, and when I asked that question, I asked it very globally. So it could have been a major diversity conference, or it could have been an in-service for 4 hours. So we don't know to that degree of specificity. We're also able to uncover some hidden talents within a staff, and this is something else that I would encourage you to keep in mind, that as you conduct a self-assessment, what you may begin and be able to find within an organization is that we have certain insights with people based upon the languages that they speak, the countries in which they may have lived or come from, the religions that they may have insights about that we aren't aware of, the fact that they may have parenting skills or contacts in certain communities in which we weren't aware of. So, for example, we ask questions, have you belonged to, were you an AKA, or were you a Delta? Were you a SORA? Were you in sororities? Were you in fraternities? Were you in elks, mooses, and those kind of animal groups is what I call them, but those kind of organizations. You know, I had to go to I think it's the Rotary, is that where they sing the national anthem, I think? And then we have to sing another song, and we had to sing Home on the Range, and the only version I could remember was Alvin and the Chipmunks version, where the deer and the cantaloupe play. And the people at my table didn't think that was funny at all. But so the other thing that you want to try to do in your lifetime is become more mature than I have. That's for sure going to be important. But in creating a site code, it also gives you an opportunity to create what's called a demographic page. So you can begin to discern who participated in the survey, and is this reflective of our HR perspective, our profile of our agency. So if, let's say, 75 people of color participated in the survey, but we know there are 150 in the organization, that begins to suggest some problem with our survey process. or if only our, let's say, European American brothers and sisters participated and this other group didn't, we have some issues there. So that becomes important to understand who participated in the survey. I often encourage us to involve all levels of the agency, including some of our janitorial staff, our maintenance folks. A couple instances quickly come to mind. Working in New York City years and years ago, there was a special ed teacher that drove, not teacher, but special ed bus driver that was driving the bus home, and some kid speaking Spanish cussed him out, so he thought, so he let him off on the freeway, right? The kid didn't get hit or anything, but can you imagine if something had happened, that organization would be sued, that director may never work again, and that bus driver probably gets another job next week. So when we think of diversity training and cultural competence, we don't just want to train provider staff. We want to think more holistically. A buddy of mine in Washington State, Hank Balderrama, crazy guy, but a real cool guy, was talking about a 24-hour crisis line that they had in one state to remain nameless. And he's Spanish speaking, so he called up in Spanish and to the crisis line saying he was suicidal and blah, 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 and they hung up on him, right? He called up again and said the same thing, and they gave him someone who spoke Vietnamese, right? So the interesting thing is that are we making sure that our front line, our reception staff, our first line of defense has been socialized and steeped in cultural competence, or is it just those who are providing direct service? Bear in mind that in many cases, the people that make or break our service delivery are the first people we encounter. So if I walk in and I get dogged out or dissed or mistreated or inappropriately treated by a reception person, that really paints how I'm going to see the rest of the folks within the organization. So we want to involve all levels of the organization. Now, if you think of residential treatment centers, right, in many cases, people with whom the kids connect might be the landscaper, might be a van driver, might be a cafeteria person. So again, if we're only doing the provider staff and we're overlooking others, we're only as strong as our weakest link. And flying into Eastern Washington one morning, I remember, they had the whole group there, and janitors were in the back, and they had the shirts with their name tag on them, and they really didn't want to be there. And 5 minutes into the presentation, they said, "Hey, James, you know what? We love you and everything, but we really don't have any of those people here, so why are we doing this?" And I'm like, whoa. And, it was a pretty mainstream group. And 5 minutes into a presentation, that's really not what you want to hear if you're going to be there all day. And I said, you know what, you're right. There aren't many people here. But when I flew in this morning, we flew over the interstate. And there's this big old truck, and it's full of them. And they're on their way here. They're changing a tire. They don't look happy, but they're going to be here by about noon. So you might want to get ready. So the thing is, again, is that as we think about diversity and stuff like that, and as we think about our organization, we're only as strong as our weakest link. So if we do this group and leave that group out, we may be vulnerable by virtue of that, if that makes any sense to you. Now, those of you who are executive directors and what have you, the other thing that you might want to make sure we do is look at our board and explain to them why we're doing this. Because if you get too far ahead of your board or your advisors, not good for your career. And also, we want to make sure that we disseminate the findings broadly. And when we do the analysis, an opportunity to clean things up a little bit. We want to have integrity there. But we want to make sure that we disseminate these findings not only to staff at all levels who participated and thank them, but also making sure that we talk to the communities that we serve and talking about how we've been informed and how we might change and if there's a role that they want to play. So when we think of self-assessment, it shouldn't be a painful thing. It shouldn't come back to haunt us. What we're doing is we're doing the intervention. We're doing the assessment to design an intervention. And that becomes an iterative process. Very much like doing a treatment plan, very much doing like a mental health assessment. We assess to intervene. So if they were drawing a schematic, it would be DX, assessment to TX, intervention to DX to TX. And it goes on and on and on. And this occurs over periods of time. That make any sense so far? Okay. Now, one of the processes that I use a pencil and paper process that I developed, and Sharon Lynn was talking about the tool that we have online, I guess at Georgetown. The National Center has a public health tool online, right, for public health professionals. The National Center has some real cool stuff on its website, and I really urge you to Google that or use another search engine to find the website, and it's a really wonderful website, and it has tremendous links and tremendous resources. So really avail yourself to that. What I'm probably going to have us do is I want us at our table, like that table's a big enough table. You guys got about 5 people. You guys got about 5, 4. I'm going to ask you guys to maybe join these folks if you don't mind. And here we go. Here we go. We're going to deal with 5 questions. And this is something I think you can do when you get home. The first question you're going to deal with is you're going to deal with I'm asking you to describe the populations your organization currently serves. Right? And we talked about the dimensions of diversity yesterday. I want you to go a little bit deeper, and I want you to talk about them in terms of these as well. So if you're dealing with diverse populations who are African American, African American and what? European American, European American and what? Does that make any sense to you? And I want us to try and go as deep as we can with that. No, so the first question, the populations we serve. The second question you're going to deal with are barriers to effective service delivery by group. So if you say language is a barrier, for example, to our Latinos, probably not to all Latinos, probably Latinos who are first generation, but probably not those who are second generation. You see what I'm saying? So what are some of the barriers by group? They don't trust us. Who are they? Is it all of them that don't trust us, or is it just some of them? So population, and I will make sure that I get the PowerPoint to the center, and next week you can probably get it from them or ask them for it, and you'll see the questions there in greater detail. What I typically do is I don't write the questions down. When we write the questions down, the answers are almost predictable. They become real literate in how we answer questions. I tend to say them, and I'll repeat them, and I'll repeat them. People hear them differently, and we get a more rich discussion. The other thing that I would do if we had more time is I'd make you guys count off, and I'd break you up by tables. The reason I do that is because I don't want friends sitting together, because they'll coddle each other, right? They won't push each other very hard, and what I want people to do is actually be uncomfortable a little bit. So the populations you serve is the first question, and what are some of the barriers to effective service delivery? Might be staffing, might be language, might be hours of operation, might be childcare, might be transportation, things of that nature, if that makes any sense to you. But we're going deeper by group. The third question is I want you to describe some of your comforts and discomforts in working cross-culturally. If you say you treat everyone the same, no you don't, nor should you. A 14-year-old or 64-year-old grandmother, one's at risk of pregnancy, you be the judge, right? That's a tough one. The way I get treated when I'm dressed like this is fundamentally different than the way I get treated when I'm dressed on the weekends. Okay? So what I'm saying is that I want to understand your comforts and your discomforts in dealing with diversity. For example, one of the problems that I have are people that have very thick accents. I don't hear that well, and I was socialized. It's only polite to say, excuse me, pardon me, so many times, and then it becomes rude. So when I stop hearing effectively, I get embarrassed. And then to pretend like you heard someone when you didn't understand them is even more condescending, even more inappropriate, if you understand what I'm saying. So it's hard for me to own the fact that I don't hear very well, and I don't hear through accents the first time very well, and I get embarrassed and I blush all over the place. You should see it. Something ugly. I also have trouble with people, for whatever reason, that may come from an ethnic group but don't value their ethnic group or look down on their ethnic group. I have trouble with that as well. So bear in mind, as wonderful and as cool as I am, I have issues and comforts and discomforts. I'll explain those in 1 second. The fourth question is to talk about the resources and linkages you have in diverse communities. So when we're trying to enhance our resource base for our clientele, do we work with local employers? Do we work with welfare? Do we work with A&D, alcohol and drug and alcohol? Do we work with the informal providers, such as urban leagues, LULACs, recreational programs, Boy Scouts, Jack and Jills, things of that nature? So describe some of your resources and linkages in diverse communities. Your fifth question is talk about some of your cross-cultural success stories and why you think they occurred. We had trouble reaching out and finding adoptive homes in this community, and then we met a charismatic pastor, and he identified 10 quick families for us, who identified 10 more. The reason we're identifying this one is because we want to be able to broker some of our successes internal to this group and internal to the field. because I think what you guys are pioneering or developing has implication for the field of child welfare generally, but also the field of adoption specifically, if that makes any sense to you. So the first question, and this one, when you ask the groups, you might have to push them, because what people will often talk about is, I work with some religious minorities, I work with some people with disabilities, some rural populations. We want them to do the 2 for the 3 for the 4 for. We want them also to go racial on us if we can, okay? Because people tend to avoid that because, as I said before, a lot of us were socialized not to talk about race, and that's the polite thing to do. The barriers begin to suggest what type of intervention, what type of training, and how we begin to prioritize that. So if we have trouble doing assessments with families, we might bring someone in who does a very specific training around assessing Latinos or assessing urban African Americans, as opposed to the generic cultural competency training. If that makes any sense to you. Comforts and discomforts has a lot of impact on the type of anti-bias curriculum, anti-bias training that we might want to engage in. What's interesting, we're in D.C. Anybody here from D.C., from D.C. government? All right. One of the first places I got to work or use my tool was with the D.C. mental health system, about 3,000 workers. And it was interesting, other 3,000, I would imagine about 85% were African American. 85% of their clientele were African American. What was interesting, even though you had this black-black match, a lot of disparaging talk, behavior, perception of the African American clients. That's why I said, a lot of great workers too, so don't get me wrong. A lot of great workers, really don't get me wrong. But my point is simply that just because one is doesn't mean one is. That having an African American work with an African American, or a Latino work with a Latino, or a woman work with a woman, doesn't necessarily guarantee success there. So I'm suggesting is that even as people of color, we have to deal with our own biases, discriminatory views, and what have you, toward ourselves, toward other ethnic groups. And the fact is, what we tend to know is we tend to all know the racial and ethnic epithets and slurs. What we tend not to know are some of the benign ways to talk to people. The resources and linkages serve 2 purposes. One is how we create treatment or service plans that are more comprehensive to maybe shore up an adoptive family, or to make sure that if we can't subsidize the adoption formally with money, what have you, then we might be able to subsidize it with resources that are naturally occurring. The other thing that it begins to suggest is, to what extent are we creating what I call a Rolodex on steroids? And what I mean by that is, do we have, as professionals, have people in the community that we can discuss things with when we don't understand? When we've been cussed out by a family for saying something, my early days as a practitioner, when I was really, really young and really, really dumb, I remember working with a fairly poor family, and I told Mom she should be saving $50 a month for little Junie's college fund. And she said to me, "Do you smell anything cooking? Do you feel any heat? Did you see the broken windows when you drove up?" And yeah, seriously humbled by that. Fortunately enough, she took me under her wing, and I learned a lot. But when I first came out and was working with just nothing but education and book stuff, I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. So with respect to resources and linkages, we have a 2-fold thing going on there. One is how they can enhance our ability to provide comprehensive services, systems of care, and so forth, but also how they might be willing to take us under their wing as mentees, as young proteges, as people that are willing to learn. Each table, I want someone to kind of record, someone to kind of make sure that everyone gets a chance to talk. We want to share the airtime. And like I said, we don't have to go very, very deep with these responses, but I want to just hear where we come to. Okay? So you guys are going to move, and we have about 30 minutes to have our little discussions. Okay? And if you have any questions, raise your hand and I'll be right there. Any thoughts or questions or comments so far? Or any worries? Let's get busy. The first question I would ask has to do with the process, how it made you feel to talk about these things. Do you have these types of conversations all the time? Was it easy to have the conversation? Was there any anxiety at all? What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, that was no problem whatsoever. No problem.
Okay.
I didn't feel how loud that would be.
Okay. Do you have these in your workplace all the time?
On a semi-regular basis, yes. We're not afraid to have them at the workplace.
It's something I really encourage us to try to do, because what I found in most organizations is they don't have these conversations. Now, what we would have spent more time with was laying down ground rules. paying attention to language and intent and impact. Because what we don't want, again, have people do is be afraid to talk because I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing about this group or that group. We want to be careful with respect to that. Normally what happens is you would be given more time because this can be a very rich conversation. The other thing that you almost, when the conversation started, the room was very, very quiet. And I told Natalie we're going to tell it's working when the volume begins to elevate, right? People become very animated. The other thing that begins to capture is within your workplaces is the talent, the experience, the wisdom that is often overlooked. And for a lot of people, what's really important, not only to do their work, but to feel like they're contributing more than just in an ordinary vein, that they get to contribute their wisdom to their colleagues, that they get to learn from their colleagues, and it makes the social work environment more social. And a big part of why we do this work is because we like people, we like the interaction. This can be very, very fun, very, very dynamic, in addition to having a high yield. With respect to what some of the products were, I'll pick on Oregon first. Where did you guys go with your conversation? How was your conversation? What did you guys talk about?
Well, I think we talked about a lot of different things. We focused, it seems like we focused more on, we had a focus on Native American, our Native American population. And there's this difference between kids who are a part of a tribe versus the kids who aren't. Just kind of the differences between how we treat and how we serve those kids. Are you talking about maybe just kind of going through the whole?
Yeah.
You know, I just want to say too that it does get it is comfortable to talk about these issues here because you kind of know what's going on here. You know, you kind of know. But I could see definitely taking this back. That would be a pretty interesting experience to take it back home. So, let's see. We also talked about kind of the differences between. One of the things is the comforts and discomforts. It seemed to be that there were some good comforts of going out, and because some of us had lived in certain communities, so it's easier for us to feel to be relevant or at least comfortable, not necessarily competent, but maybe comfortable.
Absolutely.
Of working with different families. But then on the same token, there were more discomforts than maybe comforts. It seemed that we talked that there was a lot of discomforts, and folks, and I think that's kind of the way that it goes. It almost we had to be almost intentional about saying, what are the comforts?
Yeah.
Because we just almost naturally went to the discomforts.
Well, the interesting thing, Corey, if I may interrupt you, is, if you find somebody who's comfortable in every environment, then it begins to make you wonder. You know what I mean? Some environments are easiest for us to traverse, and some of them are harder. And in some cases, if you, for example, I've done a lot of work in this part of the country. I love Maryland, but there are parts of Maryland, for example, if you work in East Baltimore is a real tough part of Maryland. And it's predominantly African American. I'm predominantly African American. And showing up there with a suit and tie on makes me look, very, very vulnerable. So, whereas I'm comfortable in most African American communities, there's certain African American communities where I have to be a little bit more on guard, and stuff like that. So, if someone tells you I'm comfortable everywhere, it might make you wonder. The other thing you raise, a real important issue, is reservation versus non-reservation. One of the things that we're facing nationally is that we know that Indian Child Welfare Act, and we know that in many reservations they provide services to our Native American brothers and sisters. However, a lot of groups, once they get off the reservation, finding services of any type are difficult, and having that intergenerational leadership where an elder or a spiritual leader isn't around necessarily help families stay intact and keep them on the straight and narrow. Anything else you want to share before I move on?
Well, I did want to say that it was a little difficult to get through the first question. Because it was almost like no one wanted to say, well, we work with African American folks, work with Native American folks, so on and so on. But then we also work with African American folks who are lower income. It's almost seemed like we kind of know, but it was kind of difficult to kind of get through that piece, and that's what we focused a lot of the time on.
Yeah, and that's a very common kind of experience. people are hard pressed to get started. And then what we're really trying to get there is I'm trying to get the groups to look at their comforts or discomforts and their knowledge base within group differences. So to say black in the 21st century, what does that really begin to tell us? To say white, to say Latino, all those kind of things are very, very broad concepts. And again, going back to my experience in Ohio, 2.5 million African Americans. I think you guys had a former Secretary of State who was very Republican, and some would say, goodness, I'm being taped again. And I do want to work in America. But and often we begin to think of African Americans as predominantly blue, and in a place where you have 2.5 million, you have blue to red. Do you know what I mean? And so what we really want to begin to experience is the diversity. And then we might begin to wonder within that group, are we more successful with the blue ones or the red ones? Are we more successful with the ones with bachelor's degrees or the ones who are working class? Are we more successful with the Christian ones or non-Christians and so forth? That's what we're trying to get at. So just to say black, if we just go back to this doesn't tell us a whole lot and doesn't really uncover some of the barriers. Anything else you want to share?
I don't think so.
Okay. I'm going to pick on my friends back there, Heidi's group. Where'd you guys go with your conversation?
We are just an awesome group, and we went.
I could tell that.
We are. So I have to apologize. I didn't realize how loud my yo was. It was just totally not for you. But anyway, we hit on the first three areas that you asked us to, a description of the population to be served, and we did go through pretty much everything. We all serve a variety.
Mm-hmm.
And both in the public and private sectors, because Pennsylvania is represented and Massachusetts is at our table, and California. Oops, sorry. And the barriers to effective service delivery, we had really good conversation around this, and I just want to mention some of them. One of the things was the ways race is recorded in our state, because, for example, with Pennsylvania, when we look at, I'm always looking at the data on children in foster care, because that is where I focus with children with the goal of adoption, and that drives my work as far as recruitment and retention and that in that area. So one of the things that I've just noticed is that when we record information, it's recorded as the federal government would, and it is blanket, black, white, Hispanic, and there is no way to identify race other than what they have listed. So basically, when we're driving our recruitment efforts or anything like that, it is surrounded towards targeting those specific populations rather than recruiting out to maybe other areas that our population might be,
Absolutely.
serving. So we talked a little bit about that. We talked about recruitment. Michelle brought up recruitment towards gay and lesbian communities. And I don't know if you want to touch about anything like that. Touch on anything? Because they started to incorporate. You had a consultant come in. Is that right? Well, somebody came in to look at how they actually incorporate all communities, all races, all things like that, and they asked them to put
in our PR list, some of our pamphlets. We've sort of taken a look at, are we inclusive? Mm-hmm. And are we sort of giving a message that everyone can be an adoptable foster parent, and including images that sort of reflect a gay couple for those who are looking for that, but if you're not, you may not think that's what it is. We specifically including like 2 women and a child, just so that we've actually had people call and say, I don't see people on your pamphlet that look like me.
Absolutely.
And so, but not just for gay and lesbian families,
right,
but
right.
also, we do some targeting to faith-based and going to churches and just sort of making sure that we are inclusive
Absolutely.
of our outreach.
Real powerful thing to do. And then I've even seen some states are allowing single parents to become more involved and making sure that pamphlets depict single parents. And in states where you have large ethnic populations, will show LGBTQs of color, right? So you do the twofer thing going on. So real powerful kind of imagery. I'm sorry.
Other area or barriers included single or biases just for workers. I'm trying to read Heidi's writing here. It's very good, Heidi. Costs towards printing and updating forms and materials in multiple languages, and we talked about that. Training and education of staff regarding cultural competency and lacking, or I don't know what that says. The lacking of that, having that training out there for everybody, and just the money and cost towards that as well. We've got on comforts and discomforts, and we listed a lot of things there. Anything that we want to highlight? I don't know, because Corey did a great job, because we did talk a lot about maybe our discomforts more than comforts, I would think. Yeah. And we didn't really notice that when we were going through, because we were trying to hurry for you.
Thank you very much.
And I don't know if there's anything else we wanted to say. We didn't get to the last two, which I was really hoping we'd get to the cross-cultural success stories, but we didn't get to
next meeting.
So thank you.
That's going to be important. Thank you very much. The other thing around comforts or discomforts is a real important one, because that might be one of the initial interventions that we begin to think about. Years ago, I used to think that everyone could be culturally competent, and I absolutely still believe that. But I think a big part is beginning to understand our biases and where we need to kind of prioritize. We all bring them to the table. And on a bad day, something might come out of your head, something might come out of your mouth that will even surprise you, believe it or not. And it might be something you heard from grandma back when you were 3, 4, 5 years old or something like that. So we all got baggage in that regard. But we want to create an environment safe enough where someone can own something like that. And someone else say, you know what, I'm glad you said that, because that's something I trip with or worries me from time to time as well. So thank you very much. Anything you want to add from?
Well, just that, we talked about how if we're recruiting and bringing people in the door, but then there's bias on the worker or the supervisor level, and they don't respond to these people. Say for example, a single parent. Well, for my kid, I don't want a single parent. So then all that time and energy towards recruitment is wasted if we're not going to really use and embrace these resources that we have available. So the training has to go across, and worker bias has to be addressed.
Absolutely. And worse, if I push you out inadvertently or advertently, not only do I lose you, but you might go home to people like you and say, that James guy, barbarian. Go up there only if you're dying. You know what I mean? So I think you're absolutely right on that. This table, you guys got pretty animated over there. Where'd you guys go with your conversation?
Everywhere.
Yeah, I thought so.
You helped us come back to where we were in describing our population. And we looked at adoptive families in our areas. And we have Florida, Arizona, Minnesota, and Ohio at the table, which is quite diverse.
Yeah.
We looked at these families, these adopted families as a whole, as working class, blue collar, white collar, Caucasian, Latino, black, faith-based everywhere except Minnesota. They weren't faith-based. We looked at heterosexual. Do I have to explain that?
Yeah, for me. Help me with that one, Minnesota.
They said they were saying that most of their adoptive families all come from a very faith-based perspective.
Oh.
And I don't know that necessarily represents all of our families. I think we've got a good mix of people who are very faith-based and people who are not.
Okay, that's Minnesota.
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you.
The groups had mostly...
Well, she made it sound like everyone was non-faith-based. Yeah, that's like, whoa.
That's the way they felt. That's how it came to us. That's the way it came across.
No, like 3 6s on their heads or something like that. You scared me for a moment. Go ahead.
We looked at the group as mostly heterosexual and a group of baby boomers. Then we got to barriers. We looked at some language barriers as a possibility. The real lack of post-adoption services, like when these families take these kids, the agencies drop them, and that's the end of the scenario. We looked at mental health as a barrier and subsidy reductions, like the foster care rate is much higher than the subsidy rate.
Yeah.
Except in Arizona.
Yeah.
Where they get this money, I don't know, but they got it.
No, you raised some really important issues. And again, one of the problems that you had at your table was that you're combining several diverse states. But what you would do in reality is you would look at different work units or different workers in the same state, and you'd probably get more rich discussion. Anything else you want to share? Go ahead, Minnesota.
I think one of the other things that we talked about is our workers and oftentimes our adoptive families, at least in Minnesota, socioeconomically and educationally may not walk across to who our kids are and who the birth families are, and there's real discrepancy in that.
Yeah, I think that's a real issue.
I agree with that. Socioeconomics and education of adoptive families and of workers are different from our birth families and our children.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is that sometimes as we become more educated, we get away from our faith-based orientation, and it becomes easy to look down on people who are more faith-based than empirical-based in their orientation to the world. And so as cool as we are as workers and stuff like that, going back, I think something that you were saying, Heidi, is we have these very subtle biases that can creep in around single parenthood or gay or lesbian parenthood, and as wonderful and as cool as we think we are, those things can be very impactful. The other thing that's interesting is that if you're dealing with people that don't do standard English, such as myself, as their primary way of communicating, what they're very skilled at is nonverbal communication, right? So you roll your eyes at the wrong time, you have the wrong harumph, and they've heard that, and in a very, very serious way, they've been dissed, and they may not come back. Anything else we want to share?
Under the conference and discomforts, we talked about language again, dialects and accents, educational levels, generational gaps, and definition of family, looking at compositions. We talked about that with the Latino and other ethnic groups.
That's an important one because one of the things that I know we found when I was working in Oregon with child welfare years and years ago is that often we had family members who didn't have any blood with ties, but were seen as uncle or grandma or so-and-so, and it was hard to do a special certification of them as a family member because they didn't. When we talk about family, we're talking about the biological nuclear typically, and by doing that, we lop off certain resources that would otherwise come to bear. Particularly with families where we had drug-affected stuff going on or criminal behavior, and we couldn't use biological families as resources. And typically, within even these networks, there's some family members or fictive kin, right, that are very stable and love this child as much as they would if it were an absolute blood tie. And because of the way we define family and the work that we do, typically, we overlook that. It almost goes back to the thing around the racial stuff, where we don't go deep with that. Another concern about how we do race is that we look at someone and we check the box, often without asking. And we're living, like I said, in a much more diverse society, and often what you see isn't what you get. Is there anything else you want to share before we move on?
Just under the resources in Lincolnville, we talked about the One Church, One Child, private agencies, cultural agencies, training in diverse families, and support groups for ethnic groups.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Where'd you guys go with your conversation?
What everybody said.
What would you add? Anything special?
No, I just wanted to add about, like, with my own experience in my area where I am youthing, I am youthing in the way how I look, but of how the older population that are youthing don't consider me to be youthing. So that was a discomfort for myself. And the population we serve is diverse, and I don't know what else, anyone else could chime in. And that religion, like the Russian Orthodox, had a very big impact on how we work with the clients. But also the strongest point is that we have relatives in a small community. Everybody knows who's related to whom.
Right.
And it is that is the strongest point in Alaska, in my area, in finding permanent placements for kids.
I think those are important. One of the things I think a lot of groups struggle with, individuals struggle with, is as you become more professional, more educated, the issue is, are you ethnic enough, right? And that's a real kind of silly, no, I won't say silly game, but an interesting game. I'll put it that way. It can be very devastating. So one of the things I would say to all of us is make sure that we're taking care of ourselves emotionally, because that can really be very harmful. If you've been estranged because you went away from school, or because they don't know your family, and you get this thing where you're not black enough, you're not Latino enough, you're not this enough, you're not that enough, it can be very, very harmful psychically.
I would just add one other thing, and that is that in Alaska we have a tribal state collaborative group which meets about 4 times a year. And front and center in the conversation is the issue of cross-cultural competence and how we work to bridge the gaps between our tribal folks and our state workers. And one of the things we talk about a lot is having courageous conversations, quote unquote, and the importance of that. And so that's become very embedded in the work that we do every day, and how we continue to have those courageous conversations.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I say the best for last. Where did you guys go with your conversation?
We did say a lot of what has been said already with the last group, and I know you're ready to go, so that's about it. No, just.
A real comedian. Yeah.
That's what I resort to when I don't have anything to say. No, so by virtue of the fact that we're all here, we were selected, our states were selected, we know what our issues are in terms of disproportionate amount of people of color in the system, so that they look alike. I think the one thing that we did touch on is the fact that somebody honestly said that it's basically primarily women and children that we are treating, so which leads us to look at what are we doing with fathers.
Absolutely.
So that's an issue that I think that we acknowledge and we're trying to work on. We also talked, and everything else was, we talked about the African American, Hispanic, and we talked about the issue of poverty a whole lot in our discussion groups, and that led into classism. And that led into our discussion for question number 2 as well. We talked a lot about poverty in this particular section, and I think because we know that there's a disproportionate amount of people of color in poverty, we're still talking about this whole race and ethnicity issue. But poverty, like there's a with the need is chronic, but the fix is temporary. It's like child welfare can't fix poverty. But so we're removing kids because of X, Y, and Z, abuse and neglect. But to return those same kids, we would have to fix sort of larger poverty issues that we can't always embrace. That's why our kids stay in the system, and that's why the same kinds of kids stay in the system. Yeah. So we had a nice, long, healthy conversation about that. We talked about the fact that even though we're trying to provide services in folks' native language, that there may be literacy issues within the actual language, so you're dealing with yet 2 translation issues. Absolutely. Not only the language, but the literacy problem within that language. We talked a lot about everything that was said in terms of comforts and discomforts. We were able to really acknowledge the fact that we were uncomfortable when somebody's different and you don't have much competency in that particular area, that there's going to be a little bit of discomfort that's associated with it. And many of the groups that were named already, probably one that I didn't hear as much is the illegal immigrants population and what you do with that, and feeling uncomfortable about reporting that and getting services with illegal immigrants. And the resources and the linkage, we talked about the fact that Title 19 and accessibility to services was an issue, that there are a lot of providers that are not accepting Title 19, and so that when you go to receive services from providers, a lot of times a person who has regular health insurance will get bumped up, and appointments are canceled. If you're Title 19, you have an appointment at 2 o'clock, and another patient comes in, and it can only come at 2 o'clock, that Title 19 person will get bumped down. So it's impacting service delivery, the Title 19, and we all know who's represented in the Title 19. A lot of discussion about, there seems to be a whole lot of faith-based outreach and grassroots outreach, and somebody mentioned also that there's been also connections with business owners for resources and services and that type of thing, which I didn't hear. Everything else was very similar to what everybody else said. That's it.
Wow, that was tremendous.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, goodness. The interesting thing about poverty is a real one, and one of the things that whereas we can't fix poverty, one of the things that we might think about advocating for our job creation in poor neighborhoods to make sure that we do better than just minimum wage jobs and stuff like that, or training programs and things of that nature. I would also admonish you to be real careful when thinking about this resurgence of this concept called the culture of poverty, which is really a real dangerous kind of notion, and quite frankly is antithetical to cultural competence as a theoretical model as well. I would just have you do some research beyond Ruby Payne and a few others on that concept, which I think is very, very dangerous. You mentioned the thing of undocumented. Anybody ever heard the term WAP? Anybody know what group it's referring to? It's actually referring to a number of groups. It means without papers. It speaks to the European groups that came here in the early 1900s who were undocumented. And this would have been, the first major wave came between 1880 and 1900, and this was Western and Northern Europeans, that when they got here, they got dissed big time by the Europeans, who were primarily Anglican or British, that preceded them. The second major wave came between 1910 and about 1928. This was Southern and Eastern, who got trashed big time by the groups that just preceded them. And this was when all the epithets formed, as I mentioned to you briefly yesterday. So when we think about the undocumented stuff, we have a big history around undocumented populations. One of the bad things about some of the new undocumented is they don't blend in quite rapidly, and they kind of look something interesting. But no, I think that given the time, you guys would have had a very, very detailed and rich conversation. I will make sure that Natalie and the center has the PowerPoint that I have for this presentation, because I think this is as an exercise back home yields a very, very powerful product. Two things occur. One is that, and we're going to be real careful on this one, is that the first three questions open wounds, believe it or not. When we ask about the populations you serve, and we stumble through that and recognize that we can't go deep with that, we ask about your comforts or discomforts. That may prick you a little bit, make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. We ask about barriers. That also is a gray area for us, or something where we're not very proud. But the last two questions are very healing, when we begin to talk about some of our resources and linkages. And then the fifth question is absolutely a healing question, where we begin to brag about some of the things that we have. And one of the things that we found with the fifth question is often within a given organization is there are quite often people within the same organization that don't know the success stories that occurred on another floor or another department. So it just suggests that as a self-assessment exercise, all it would take is a little bit of group facilitation skills, about an hour and a half, and like I said, I wish we'd had more time, and I wish I was a little bit more energized today, and we would have had a whole lot of fun with it. But I just want to thank you guys for being a very interactive group. Thank you for playing my little silly games. And I really want to thank you for just being totally hospitable while I've been here. It's been an absolute blast. And again, thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to coming back in the future, and wish you guys continued happiness and success in all you do. We're out of here.